Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a US election special where I'm just going to be looking at one particular subject, and the subject is whether Trump is a great businessman or not, and some of the revelations coming out about Trump on The Apprentice, to show that actually he holds very dear. There are some analysts that say that if Trump is to look back on his life, in his eyes, his biggest crowning glory isn't being the president of the US, but actually being on The Apprentice and being the center of attention and being held up as this ideal of who he would like to be that is actually detached from reality. So they kind of created this persona of Trump that was what he would like to have been, but isn't actually what he was. And it's really interesting when you look at some of the writings about him. It is, and people who've interviewed him consistently, it is The Apprentice that he fixates on. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. Now, the idea was in 2016, and I think there is still elements of this now. This is a myth that has continued. In 2016, the idea was he was this great businessman, and being a great businessman would make him a great president because he would take his business acumen and bring that into running the country from that point of view, and using those skills to keep budgets under control, to get the best deals, etc., etc. Now, it's definitely true that he's very transactional from a micro business point of view. But of course, those kind of transactional skills that may be good in a one-on-one, I'm trying to beat you down in price or whatever. This is me against you. It is a zero-sum game. You know, what you gain here, I lose, and vice versa. So I need to get the one up over you. Now, that kind of micro transactional business scenario is not really always applicable to running a country where you're working with alliances. It's not a zero-sum game, but often a positive-sum game. Something like NATO alliance being an incredibly important military alliance. He sees that as a micro-transactional business scenario whereby you haven't paid enough into your defense budget, therefore you owe us, and that's taken away from us, and therefore screw you, NATO, we're going to get out of NATO, this is not good for us. Without understanding actually it is exceedingly good for you, and understanding the context of the geopolitical landscape of the globe and of the US's position in this kind of four-dimensional chess game, and the global hegemony, you know, the supreme power that the US has in the world. That is a return on investment from investing into the globe and investing into NATO and global security and allied security. That is a very complex calculation to make, and I don't think he has the wherewithal to make that. Literally, I don't think he understands how the world works and how these complex alliances work and what benefits the US gains. He thinks in purely transactional terms, and he thinks it's us against them, and therefore it's isolationism. Tariffs build up a barrier. We are competing against you. I'm going to put up a barrier against all of your stuff coming in without realizing that's going to cause inflation, blah, 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 blah. So I don't think he has much economic acumen and geopolitical acumen. And it's really understood by his very simplistic understanding of reality, such that he thinks everything is transactional. Okay, so to go back to this myth that he is this great businessman, it comes down to what he did on The Apprentice. Because actually, if you go back before The Apprentice and even see actually after The Apprentice and during it, he's not got a good track record for being a good businessman. He literally, it's terrible. I mean, whether it be court cases and, you know, losing what's it, $25 million in the Trump University. You got Trump Foundation. He's not allowed to run a charity, and he's been bankrupted 6 times. Here is a Los Angeles to LA Times column piece on entitled "A Lengthy List of Trump's Disastrous Business Deals compiled by his newest business partners." And it's basically just a big old list of how everything has gone wrong for him in a business sense. So he has had 6 entities now declared bankrupt. Now, if you are a really good businessman, you wouldn't expect that. In fact, it's got to the point. I mean, here we have a Yahoo finance piece on we're watching Trump's 7th bankruptcy unfold. That's back in 2020. As a businessman, Donald Trump ran 6 businesses that declared bankruptcy because they couldn't pay their bills. As a president, and even when you see his campaign from 2016, 2020, 2024, he has not paid bills all around the country. He owes a lot of people a lot of money. Even Mark Cuban was talking about his fellow colleague on the Shark Tank, which is the American version of Dragon's Den, who is still owed like $4 million, I think, by Donald Trump for doing a bunch of work for him. And you're like, he just doesn't pay his bills anyway. He's gone bankrupt. He's got to be one of the few people that's run a casino and gone bankrupt on that. I mean, you've got to work really hard at losing money running a casino. Anyway, as the president running for a 2nd term, Trump is repeating some of the mistakes he made as a businessman and risking the downfall of yet another venture, his own political operation. And then it goes on to talk about the issues he's had in the business world. Now, I don't want to get into the long weeds of details of that. You can easily go and Google all of this. One of the interesting nuggets is that if he had taken it, so he didn't work for that money and for his business empire. He inherited it. So he you know, you talk about a meritocracy. He has not merited the position he's in right now. In fact, he's made a bit of a pig's ear of it, as seen by these bankruptcies. And actually, his value isn't as much as he often claims it is. It's very grey area as to how much he's actually worth. There are a lot of buildings that have the Trump's name on, but they are not actually owned by Trump, even though they have his name on. So there's an element of Trump's business acumen and his overall wealth being a facade. And here Forbes, you know, pretty capitalistic organization here, saying it's official, Trump would be richer if he had just invested his inheritance into the S&P 500. So this is the idea that actually he's not done a very good job with his money that he inherited, and he inherited an absolute ton of money, and he was, you know, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, effectively. Trump critics have long claimed that if the former president had simply taken his money his father gave him, stuck it in the S&P 500 and watched the money appreciate over time, he'd be far richer. But for years, those critics were wrong. In fact, Trump outperformed the market for much of his life, developing some great buildings, lucking out on a couple of other projects and capitalizing on a knack for marketing. But markets change and so do fortunes, especially in times of upheaval. Since US equities crashed in the early days of the pandemic, they've gone on a stunning run, largely thanks to the growth in big technology companies. Trump's fortune also plunged at the outset of the pandemic, but his real estate empire, concentrated in urban office buildings, hotels and storefronts, hasn't come roaring back. The result is the oft-repeated long false claim that Trump would have been richer if he had just stuck his inheritance in the S&P 500 finally turned into truth. As of today, Trump would be an estimated $400 million richer if he had just put his father's money into the index. Now, that was back in 2022, and it's broadly going to be somewhat similar now, I would have thought. But, you know, whether that's exactly true or not is not the point particularly. It's about whether he is this great businessman that he claims he is, or that many people who voted for him think that he is. And we've got to this situation recently where, or got to a point where, here we have an NBC entity coming out and saying, well, we created the Apprentice and actually we generated a myth. And Snopes has actually just written about this, saying, fact check about the claim former Apprentice exec apologized for creating a monster in Trump and endorsed Harris. Actually, it is correct. So let's look into this, and I'll talk you through a couple of videos that have just turned up, interviewing where the NBC executive has been interviewed on mainstream media here.
NBC marketing executive John D. Miller, both NBC, by the way, News and MSNBC are part of Comcast, NBC Universal. All right. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Okay, good.
I tried to talk to you and others during the 2016 campaign about the myth of Donald Trump from The Apprentice, because what I would hear when I was talking to voters was that they were voting for him because they thought he would do a good job because he was a good businessman.
Right.
And I said, how do you know he's a good businessman? Because I saw him on The Apprentice.
Yeah.
I heard this from multiple people.
Yeah, we were very good at what we did in marketing shows. And in this particular case, creating the false narrative for Donald Trump as a big businessman was very important. The thing is that people had to... The conceit of this show was you didn't win a date, you won a career. And so people had to come in, and for $250,000 if they won, they would get a chance to spend a year with a CEO that would be the person, the apprentice by their sides, learning everything they could.
They get mentored.
Yes, correct. Well, that was pretty much a false narrative as well. But the big thing is that we had to make Donald Trump look...
So it's really interesting because almost everything about the show appears to have been false. So as he said there, just a little aside, well, actually, they weren't even going to get mentored. Like, it is just a big facade. You know, what was promised to them is very much how Trump existed as a president from 2016 to 2020, which is make these big promises, you know, a lot of bravado, but actually not really coming through on those promises, and it's all a bit of a facade, right?
Like he was a big executive. And before that, he was largely popular in New York. He'd been bankrupt at least 4 times from various businesses. I think 2 more after the show went on the air.
Yep, 6 times.
And so clearly we had to make something bigger than it was. As I sort of say in promotion, we're making mountains out of molehills every day.
So he wasn't a good business executive.
Well, if someone had been bankrupt, one of his businesses 4 different times, and then 6 in total, I'm not so sure. And the reason I came forward to a large degree was there's so many people that say that the economy is the biggest thing in this election. And just as you related to us just a minute ago, if people think that he's the person for that because he was a great businessman, that is a false narrative. We did it for the show, but it became very dangerous now for the country.
So there are Americans now who will say, I don't need to look to The Apprentice. I can look to the 4 years while he was in office. And I thought he did a good job while he was in office. What do you say to them about maybe the foundational idea they have of Donald Trump in their mind?
The reality of what happened economically in Trump's tenure was that actually there was a manufacturing loss even before COVID. So they had lost, 200,000 manufacturing jobs before COVID hit. Trump would blame that loss on COVID, but it actually started happening before that. There were the tax cuts that added trillions to the deficit. And he inherited, and in fact, Obama has just been talking about this on the campaign trail. He inherited an amazingly good economy off Obama that had 75 straight months of growth. So 75 straight months of growth. You take that over, you are going to have a very healthy economy. And then he says, look, he only had 1 term, right? And generally, you look at what's happened now with the Bidenomics is it takes 3 years for your policies to be put in place for that to come to fruition. So actually, the economy now in the US is really doing very well, but precisely because, or at least largely, partly, however much you could, because these things operate in a global framework. But the US is doing better than other global not competitors, nations, other nations. And that is because of the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act, so on and so forth. All these things that were put in place to stimulate the economy, bish, bash, bosh. Okay, it's doing really well. With Trump, he didn't really do an awful lot. He promised the infrastructure bill, never happened. Promised Medicare, never happened, or a replacement to Medicare, never happened. Promised all these things. One thing he did do was do tax cuts, but that actually added to the deficit. And so there is no really good evidence to suggest that he was good with the economy. And the idea that he should have been anyway was based on a myth. So again, it's all smoke and mirrors.
Well, there were some sophisticated things that went on in the economy. First of all, as Obama basically said, he left Trump with a very good economy. And along the way,
75 months of growth.
Much, and so he sort of got out of the way of it. And so what I would say is that he was lucky along the way until he hit a stumbling block, which was the pandemic, in which case he very much mishandled along that way. Now, he did give a tax cut to a lot of different people, but not many people in a certain economic spectrum took great advantage of that. And so what I would say to them is maybe he helped you a little bit, but what I would say is the last 4 years have actually also been very strong, with the stock market hitting new highs and inflation now low, unemployment also low. And so I think that he did a very good job of selling himself, which is what he always did.
Economists will argue that presidents don't really have that much sway over the economy because the economy moves so slowly, and a decision that you make during your presidency doesn't really come to fruition, so the results of it until many years down the line. So would you be arguing that the Donald Trump that you saw during COVID was more the Donald Trump as the executive he was before he was elected into office?
He rarely was, in my knowledge of him and working with him and talking to him, because I knew him for a number of years in this particular period of time, is that he was very good at selling himself. He was very good at telling what he did without actually doing it. And to a large degree, he followed along what maybe he learned what...
Infrastructure bill every month. If you remember, people forget stuff, right? But if you remember 2016 to 2020, he promised every week, every month, we got an infrastructure bill coming, infrastructure bill. It never happened. Biden took over. It happened almost, as soon as it possibly could. These are people interested in governing, and there was someone that's not interested in governing, that was interested in self-aggrandizing. And actually, that fits really in with our understanding of him as a narcissistic, someone with arguably narcissistic personality disorder, as many people have informally claimed. But it is all about how wonderful he is without actually doing anything to justify declaring him as wonderful from an objective, evaluative point of view.
What we did in the show, because we created the persona for him and he went along with it, and that was very much advantage to him. But to a large degree, not true.
We are less than 3 weeks before the next election. Why are you writing this now? Yeah. Why?
Okay. So he's obviously, not obviously, but he's, I think, writing a book, and that's all in the process of doing so. And that's why he's coming out and saying this. I'm going to check in with another interview of him that will say similar stuff.
Joining me now is John D. Miller, former chief marketer for our sister network, NBC. This week, he wrote in U.S. News and World Report about his regret leading the team that marketed The Apprentice. Also joining me is Tim O'Brien, senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion and an MSNBC political analyst and pal of the show. Thank you both for being here. It's great to meet you, Mr. Miller. I want to read you to yourself. I'm going to read you to you. You wrote this. You wrote, "We created a monster. Trump was a TV fantasy invented for The Apprentice. At NBC, we promoted the show relentlessly. Thousands of 30-second promo spots that spread the fantasy of Trump's supposed business acumen were beamed over the airwaves to nearly every household in the country. The image of Trump that we promoted was highly exaggerated. In fact, Trump declared business bankruptcy 4 times before the show went into production, and at least twice more during his 14 seasons hosting. The imposing boardroom where he famously fired contestants was a set because the real boardroom was too old and shabby for TV. I also learned from working with him that he has questionable judgment. At the wrap party for The Apprentice Season 3, he pitched an idea for the upcoming season. This is wild. He told me we should make a team of black players compete against white players. My first thought was, WTF.
Yes.
Talk a little bit. Okay, that first part, that though, is I mean, all of that's fascinating, but the idea that you know, if you've got Trump, who is I would claim, incredibly narcissistic and self-absorbed, and is massively interested or massively vulnerable to flattery. We know this from his interactions with dictators around the world who flatter him and are able to manipulate him. He is incredibly easily manipulatable. And this is something I think that he says in this interview, or maybe the rest of that interview that I've cut off previously. But he says, actually, you can flatter him and it's really easy to manipulate him. So what your man here said was that we were absolutely flooding the airways with these 30-second spots of The Apprentice and how amazing Donald Trump was and the power of this ballroom executive, etc., etc. And what Trump would have done is watched all of that, and that would have fed into his sense of self, his generated sense of self that he then takes on board, or generates a sense of who he is from NBC and their marketing. He then believes that, and he almost he inhabits that from a psychological point of view, if not from an actual real business point of view. I don't think he's ever been that kind of businessman. He's more like a swindler and a con artist, as far as I can work out. But they fed him exactly what he wanted to hear. And so that's what he took with him into campaigning, but in 2016, 2020, and 2024. But he's not that person.
About the way that that Trump was in reality versus the Trump that people saw on the show.
Well, what you see right now is sort of what he was in reality. He was, to a large degree, someone who was an entertainer. He really was not a good businessman. Our job is, from a marketing perspective, for the conceit of the show, was to make it seem like he was a legitimate businessman, competent, good judgment, compassion when needed. None of those things were actually apparent, but that's what we had to do to make the show work. And so we created that narrative, made it seem like it was money, like he was living in royalty, with the cars and the limousines and the helicopter all labeled Trump, in gilded, like the gilded New York age, and then had to position him as a great potential CEO. And I say potential because he never really was a CEO. Right. He was a lot of little businesses that he had. But to make the show work, we had to make it seem like that. And unfortunately, because we just pummeled American with those messages, that remains there right now. And to many people, even though there is significant things that you can see right now where that's not true, many people think it is. And
there is a myth that's been generated and perpetuated by these television series that are fed into the public consciousness to the point where they really have a fundamental misunderstanding of how adroit Trump really is, how he is some kind of business genius when he clearly is not. And they have generated that sense of who he is and marketed that to the US population. And you reap what you sow. And this is kind of, I guess Miller's sense here is that I feel bad for doing this. I've gone out and created this monster, which I think was the title of the article he wrote, something along those lines, which is I've created this monster, and now I feel I have to come out and say, yeah, sorry about that, because that was our creation.
Now, with the economy being one of those things that people are looking at, we made him seem to be a very smart businessman. And quite honestly, that is not true, because he wouldn't have 4 bankruptcies and then ultimately 6 during the time of Apprentice if he was that good.
Right. And I mean, look, Mark Cuban is on a TV show, but that's because he's judging other businesses, and he's a very successful businessman and really genuinely rich. But Tim, we've talked about this a lot. Donald Trump was not as rich as he said he was. Right. He was definitely not that successful. His company was just a little series of LLCs. He doesn't even own most of the buildings with the word Trump on them. Talk about the real Donald Trump, and what do you think was the damage done by people really genuinely believing that Trump really was successful?
Well, I mean, I think The Apprentice was his ticket into the White House.
Absolutely.
Prior to The Apprentice, he was this punchline of jokes about the excesses of the 1980s. He was out in the tundra. No one did big deals with him. He was an afterthought on comedy shows. He was this sort of subject of ridicule, and New Yorkers knew him as like one of the sort of dirigibles you float above the city as a feature of New York life. But he wasn't a major real estate developer. The real estate community shunned him. And he had this very fortunate intersection with Mark Burnett. And Mark Burnett, who was an immigrant, was selling blue jeans in California and read Art of the Deal. And it was like his Bible to the American dream. And he always thought, he told me this, that he would one day do a show that embodied the spirit of the Art of the Deal. But remember, the Art of the Deal itself is a book. It's a nonfiction work of fiction.
That Trump didn't even write.
He didn't even write it, and the whole thing is full of errors and
It's really important to understand it. I mean, I've not read The Art of the Deal, but by all accounts, it was A, not written by him, and B, basically largely a load of bollocks. And he's kind of grifted off that and then been portrayed as this great businessman on The Apprentice. And as this Washington Post article states, and this has been said in a number of places, that The Apprentice is still Donald Trump's proudest moment. There was who was the... it might be, was it Mark? No, Mark Burnett is the author of The Art of the Deal. There is someone who has interviewed Trump a number of times throughout the years and has actually spent more time with him. I think he's written a book on Trump, and he's the guy that has said that that The Apprentice is his proudest moment. I don't know if it is Ramin Setuda here. I don't know that it is. But anyway, it might be Apprentice in Wonderland, that how Donald Trump and Mark Burnett took America through the looking glass. Actually, it might be him. I think I've seen this guy interviewed on TV talking about this. So how The Apprentice is the absolute pinnacle of Trump's life, not being the president of the US, not going and meeting with all these incredible figures around the world or trying to make the world a better place and do this or that. It was about him being the absolute center of attention and being put up on this pedestal to a position that actually he didn't really warrant.
Apologizing and presenting him as a great deal maker when he wasn't a great deal maker. He routinely got taken to the cleaners by other deal makers. He overpaid, he went into debt, he went into bankruptcy, and then The Apprentice rolls around via Mark Burnett, and he gets recreated as this entrepreneurial guru to the masses, when in fact he was a serial bankruptcy artist. As you know, as John noted, his real office in Trump Tower was like this relic of the 1980s. Shag carpeting, you know, crummy furniture.
I heard the exact same thing when I wrote my book, Man Who Sold America. I interviewed somebody who was a contestant on one of the seasons of The Apprentice who said it was kind of shocking to see how shabby the boardroom was in the real Trump Tower.
And he still wears the same suits and ties and shirts that he wore in that
that are down to his knees, like he's a church deacon from the 1980s.
Yeah, like baked in amber of that era. And I think that the myth of him being an unusually gifted businessman is what sold him to voters in 2016.
Yeah, and they still do. You still hear people say, well, I'm going to vote for him because he's a businessman, understands the economy. Let's play a clip from The Apprentice. This is one of the sort of moments when he sort of showed who he really is, the vile person that he is. Here it is.
I, at this point, am the team chooser, not the team leader yet.
Excuse me, you dropped to your knees.
Yes. And begged to do this. And I said, I'm looking around the room, and we had even LaToya, who sitting beside me, thought maybe Brandy was right.
Must be a pretty picture you dropped into
John
your
and
knees.
Dennis.
I mean, that was a glimpse of the real him.
That got into the Celebrity Apprentice at that point, where it sort of got into the later seasons. But he didn't do quite that much to people that he didn't know. Sometimes the celebrities, he could do that a little harder. But going back to the casting, the reason that Donald Trump got cast, because almost no other CEO would do it. They did have a thought of doing some with other CEOs.
Sure. Because they didn't have the time, because they had real jobs and money.
Right.
And dignity.
Yeah, he had, well, he
needed the money, right?
He at that point, because he was bankrupt, yes, and he made most of his money off the integrations of the shows. And the black versus white thing, when he told me about that, I basically had to think about how do I do it, because you don't want to make him mad, but the same token, I had to say, what are you, crazy?
Yeah.
So what I did was I said, I can see why you think that would be a noisy idea, because everybody would be talking about it. Headlines everywhere.
Was the idea that he thought it would prove some sort of racial superiority of white people?
That probably was. Then I said, you're going to lose money because you make most of your money off the integrations, and there's not going to be a company that's going to want to touch that.
And what would he have done if the black team had won? He probably would have had a complete meltdown. The other piece about it is that he benefits from a level of sycophancy that I think most people can't imagine ever having to deal with in their real life. This is Stephen Miller, the architect of his child separation policy, commenting on his performance at the Al Smith dinner. That was the single best comedy.
Yeah, and she goes on here to talk about how people like Stephen Miller, real sycophants who are very much yes men, talking about how wonderful he is performing, saying, Stephen Miller talked about his performance at the Al what was it, the dinner, the Catholic dinner, that he just I guess performed at, turned up to give his comedic speech, scare quotes, comedic speech. Fun fact, he's admitted that a lot of it was written by Fox News. Literally, he's getting Fox News. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation to be having. But Stephen Miller saying how wonderful he was there, and then saying how wonderful he was, saying it was the greatest ever speech that he gave at the or performance or whatever political rally, I don't know what you would call it, where he was at the Economic Club of Chicago with Micklethwaite, the editor-in-chief from Bloomberg News, and he absolutely tanked it. It was like an absolutely objectively terrible event where he just showed that he has no economic nous at all. And people like Stephen Miller say how it's the greatest ever performance ever. And you're like, you feed the man with this kind of... Actually, I will continue to play this because it might be the bit where they talk about, dictators giving him this false sense of, being able to manipulate him by flattery. But he absolutely feeds off flattery. He loves it.
Performance of any president or candidate for president in history. But what made his comedy set even more extraordinary was that the jokes were politically devastating for Kamala. He absolutely crushed the Democrats tonight. He did the same thing about the Bloomberg interview, the disastrous Bloomberg interview in which he couldn't even explain tariffs. And he said it was the greatest live interview any political leader or politician has done on the economy in our lifetimes. Period. I mean, he has people doing that for him all the time.
Because to survive in his orbit, you have to kiss the ring.
Yeah.
And he tends to attract C- people.
That guy definitely is that.
Yeah, and I think, in both his business life and political life, he has never had first-rate people who are much sought-after talents. What he has are people who either think they can take advantage of him, they usually are proven wrong, or they're people who are just sub-level and they think that they can get into the spotlight and ride his coattails, and they know that to stay there, they've got to bend the knee, kiss the ring.
He is the single most easy person to manipulate that I've ever worked with.
Wow.
And quite honestly...
That is a massive claim. So you got Miller here saying he's the single easiest person I've ever worked with to manipulate. This is been attested to by a number of people talking about his interactions with world leaders. He goes in with Putin alone, with only him and a translator. This is at the Helsinki, just before the Helsinki press conference, comes out. So no one knows what went on in that meeting, comes out and he's waxing lyrical about Putin and basically bends to Putin's will and says in a press conference that wouldn't it be a great idea? Putin said this amazing idea that he can have his peeps come over to the US and investigate us and help us do this investigation into... You're like, those are the people we're investigating and you're inviting them to, like... Anyway, and it goes to show that he's not a good negotiator. He's not a good deal maker. And in fact, as soon as you flatter him, he's putty in your hands.
Coattails, and they know to stay there, they've got to
kiss
bend the knee, kiss the ring.
He is the single most easy person to manipulate that I've ever worked with.
Wow.
And quite honestly, the easiest thing, he has an unfillable hole for compliments. People that would make anybody blush and say, oh, no, too much, that never happens to him. So you can do it in grand doses, and when you do that, you're a genius.
Yeah.
And call
There
me
you
many
go.
times a genius. I'm a good marketer. I don't know if I'm a genius.
Yeah.
But then if you disagree with him, you're an idiot. I don't think I'm an idiot either.
Yeah.
Maybe not somewhere in between.
Yeah.
But quite honestly, it was black or white with him.
Yeah, and he does it now where he, to try to explain, he tries to say, well, no one wants to work with Kamala Harris, and no one wants to work with her, but most of the people who worked with him don't want anything to do with his new campaign. But he says, oh, well, they were terrible people. I fired them because they were awful, right? Like, he can never...
Yes.
And the fact is, she's attracted to her campaign some of the best political
Liz
operatives
Cheney,
in
Dick Cheney, and
the
AOC.
country, and Republicans. So
Absolutely.
that math doesn't work.
Did it surprise you when the gimmick that made him famous made him president, that he became president?
Yes, well, it was less surprising than disturbing,
Yeah.
because I knew I was complicit in it.
Yeah.
And that was difficult to do. And the reason that I'm coming forward now, first, I was an executive for a long time, and I really couldn't speak up at that point. I retired a couple of years ago, and I said, well, a few weeks ago, I said, well, what can I do? And I said, I have to tell this story, because I hope it's not too late, but I helped pull the wool over America's eyes towards a guy that should not be president, should never be president, and should be fired from the whole thing.
You know who says the same thing? Tony Schwartz, the guy who really wrote Art of the Deal.
And Tony has a lot of guilt about
it. And he said exactly the same thing, sitting exactly where you're sitting on this set. John D. Miller, thank you so much, and I appreciate you.
I'd have to look into that. Tony Schwartz, the guy that really wrote Art of the Deal. So I don't know about that. That I'll have to look into that. But interesting that he is someone that said exactly the same thing. Fascinating. Anyway, I just thought I would sort of, I really wanted to discuss these videos because I found them absolutely fascinating. That you have this myth of a man that has, perception is reality. So for many people, this is real, and they are acting on it as if it is real, and it kind of almost becomes real because it's real to these people. But of course, it's not real. Like, objectively, he's not a good businessman. And, NBC created this sense of who he was, but it's now so firmly embedded in the American psyche that it's very hard to unpick. And that means that people end up voting for him on the basis that he is some great businessman. What a lot of damage that myth has done, I think, to the United States. Anyway, let me know what you think. That was just a very narrow topic field I wanted to talk about. Thanks for putting up with me waffling on and looking at these videos. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.